Moscow, March 5th, 1953. Joseph Stalin, dictator of the Soviet Empire for 30 years, died at age 73. Not long before his death, he prophesied to his closest associates, "I pity you, but I am gone. The imperialists will finish you all off like flies." Lavrentiy Beria and Georgy Malenkov were the chief contenders for power. Malenkov was a top Communist Party functionary. For years, Beria, the ruthless head of the secret police, had been the second most powerful man in the Soviet Empire. He was both hated and feared by the party elite, including Nikita Khrushchev. In Stalin's twilight years, Khrushchev was close to the dictator, but nobody ever considered him a possible successor. Khrushchev felt he had little chance of surviving if Beria succeeded Stalin, so he masterminded a bold and risky plot. He knew that the legendary Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov was Beria's most powerful secret enemy. Khrushchev convinced Zhukov and the party elite to support him. The fear of Beria united the plotters.
Khrushchev liked to recall this particular Politburo session in the Kremlin. At Khrushchev's signal, Marshal Zhukov and several of his generals broke into the hall, surrounded Beria, twisted his hands behind his back, and dragged him out. According to another version, he was put on trial and sentenced to death, but the official execution was never carried out. On the way back to his cell from court, Beria was shot by the escort of generals who hated and feared him.
For 20 years, Nikita Khrushchev had blindly and dutifully done his master's bidding. Before the Second World War, Stalin put him in charge of the Ukraine. During the war, he was promoted to Major General, participating in the defense of Stalingrad and the liberation of Kiev. Once the war was over, Stalin appointed him head of the Moscow Party Committee. Khrushchev efficiently handled all of those responsibilities, but he also had a less serious side to his personality.
Stalin used to call him a clown. During late-night parties at Stalin's dacha, he would suddenly burst into song and dance. He liked to play the fool, and did it really well.
But Stalin's clown had also ruthlessly conspired to become the new Soviet leader. Over the years, this type of paradox emerged again and again. Khrushchev tried to distance himself from Stalin's legacy while resorting to some of the same strong-arm tactics. He improved working conditions and reformed Soviet communism, but brutally repressed any expressions of freedom. He pursued peace with the West and then brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. It came as a total surprise to foreign leaders when Khrushchev disposed of Lavrentiy Beria and seized the reins of power. By 1955, at the summit of the four superpowers in Geneva, it was clear that Khrushchev was the man in charge. On this world stage, Khrushchev knew he had to rely on intelligence to outmaneuver his international rivals, just as he had used inside information to gain power within the Soviet Union.
Khrushchev attached an enormous amount of importance to intelligence gathering. Khrushchev received a foreign intelligence briefing every morning. It was given to him in the form of raw intelligence collected by KGB agents from around the world. Khrushchev was very interested in the psychology of the leaders that he was interacting with. He had two approaches to learning about the psychology of his adversaries. One was by reading inside information about them, which the KGB would collect. The other was actually by meeting them.
The Cold War was in full swing. American reconnaissance planes flew numerous missions over the Soviet Union. Recently declassified documents have revealed that the Soviets shot many of them down. It's still not known how many U.S. planes were lost in these secret missions over the USSR. At least 30, probably more. To counter these losses, President Eisenhower suggested a new strategy at the Geneva summit. He proposed his Open Skies plan, which would legally allow both countries to fly over the other's territories. But the U.S. also had another agenda.
They needed some kind of a PR gesture to deflect this impression that they came empty-handed. One of Eisenhower's advisors on public relations came up with this idea of open skies, and, it worked. So it was like, okay, it's a nice propaganda gesture, but if the Soviets agreed, nobody expected they would agree. But if they agreed, it would be a great intelligence opportunity.
Khrushchev knew too well that U.S. leaders were quite open with the American public about their military arsenal. It was the Soviets who had secrets to guard.
Khrushchev's first reaction was a blatant attempt to spy on the Soviet Union. And he was right.
Khrushchev opposed the plan, and it was rejected. Although American reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union had been an annoyance to Khrushchev, he knew the inferiority of his country's strategic forces was a much more serious problem. For 10 years, the Soviets kept a huge army in Europe. The West saw it as an act of pure aggression, but the reality was different.
Нет средств доставки бомбы на американский континент.
We had no means to deliver a bomb to the American continent. Our anti-aircraft system was too weak to oppose U.S. strategic air power. We needed something to counter a possible nuclear blitzkrieg, so we kept our armies in Central Europe. That's why the Western European allies always held the U.S. back from sudden moves.
Many Soviet officials pushed for development of their own force of long-range bombers. But Khrushchev had another plan. By the mid-50s, the Soviets had built several types of strategic bombers. But instead of starting their mass production, Khrushchev dropped the idea to concentrate all efforts on developing ballistic missiles. The secret turning point for the Soviet missile program actually occurred in 1945. When the Russians, including Lavrenti Beria, reached the German Missile Design Center at Peenemünde, they found only remnants of the huge complex. The chief designer and his key scientists had already fled to the United States with over 20 nearly finished rockets. The Russians were left with second best, but they did capture enough scientists and technical data to copy the rocket. The R-1, the first Russian rocket, was an exact duplicate of the German FAU-2. In the following years, a leading Soviet missile designer, Sergei Korolev, was given the task of developing new types of Soviet missiles. Boris Chertok was his first deputy.
Khrushchev was right in appreciating both aspects of missile technology. The first advantage was purely military, the second, political. Missile experts and nuclear scientists played a crucial role in the Cold War, as they made it possible to deliver a nuclear strike to America. The U.S. could not feel invulnerable anymore.
In 1955, Korolev successfully tested the R-5, a medium-range missile. Equipped with a 3.5 megaton nuclear warhead, it was over 150 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Khrushchev needed to conceal this new focus on long-range missiles from the U.S. He ordered his secret services to carry out a covert operation codenamed Merry-Go-Round. At an Aviation Day parade in Moscow, a group of Tu-95 strategic bombers circled around and around the city, creating the illusion of a giant armada. In fact, there were only 10. Khrushchev's deception succeeded. The United States responded by hastily developing an anti-aircraft defense system and by expanding the production of its own strategic bombers. As a result, the American military had 1,500 operational bombers by the early 60s. The Soviets had no more than 40. Disinformation and bluff had become Khrushchev's favorite tools of international diplomacy. He also knew that deception and intelligence were no less important in order to maintain his control within the Soviet Union. Khrushchev had ample grounds to consider the KGB leadership an internal threat, since many had been loyal to Lavrenti Beria. To stay in power, Khrushchev needed to find a way to change the allegiance of the agency. He appointed a trusted protege, Alexander Sheliapin, as the new head of the KGB.
He told me, we must start with KGB personnel, get rid of all who are guilty, those linked to Beria, those with dirty hands. This I did. He also said, we must continue to rehabilitate innocent victims of the purges. Then he added, I have a personal request. Please make sure that nobody, not even the KGB, can eavesdrop on me.
Khrushchev also drastically changed Soviet diplomacy. During his 30 years as dictator, Stalin went abroad twice. Khrushchev made 60 foreign trips in 10 years. He passionately wanted to see the world, to compare, to learn, but also to find new allies and propagate the so-called Soviet way of life. In 1956, Khrushchev got new proof of how important intelligence information could be when traveling abroad. That year, he boarded a Soviet warship for a state visit to Great Britain. Just before his arrival, Khrushchev received a secret cable. A Soviet spy in the British Admiralty reported that British intelligence was planning a covert operation, possibly an attempt on his life. The operation was to be carried out by sabotage divers.
Khrushchev was on board at the time when our counterintelligence and the crew together found out that a diver was swimming under the hull of the ship. Can you imagine that? Of course, there was a lot of fuss and hullabaloo, but we dealt with him elegantly, and there were no traces left afterwards.
2 months later, the headless corpse of Lionel Crabb, a British Navy diver, was found floating near the harbor. That same year, Khrushchev began to publicly distance himself from Stalin's regime. At the 20th Communist Party Congress in Moscow, Khrushchev shocked the party elite by condemning Stalin and his many crimes against his own people. During the purges of the 1930s, millions of Soviets were imprisoned and executed for the slightest appearance of opposition to Stalin and his policies. Khrushchev's report was like a bombshell. Many cried, some fainted as they learned for the first time of the brutal purges. It was a bold move, which also put his reputation in jeopardy.
Khrushchev knew he too was guilty, but we must credit him with the courage he found to make this step. It is true, he was involved with all these purges and arrests going on throughout all levels of Soviet society, even inside the party itself. How could Khrushchev possibly not know? His signatures were on many of the arrest warrants.
It was a courageous act, but necessary for Khrushchev to consolidate his support, since millions in the Soviet Union still worshipped the late dictator. Khrushchev also introduced radical domestic reforms. With his destruction of the Gulag, hundreds of thousands of prisoners were freed. Workers were given an extra day off each week, and their working day was shortened. The Iron Curtain was even slightly lifted to allow for tourism from abroad. The symbolic culmination of these reforms took place in 1961 under the cover of darkness. After Stalin's death, his body had been placed next to Lenin's in the mausoleum on Red Square for ages to come. In the middle of the night, Alexander Shaliapin, then head of the KGB, supervised an operation to remove Stalin's body from the mausoleum. To avoid a public outcry, militia surrounded Red Square.
There are moments you remember for your entire life. I was scared, terribly scared. And can you imagine? They were carrying him out upright like this. Not the usual way, horizontally, but vertically somehow. I don't know. Perhaps that's some Georgian custom. I had a feeling that he would open his eyes and say, "What are you doing to me, you bastards?"
Stalin's body was buried the same night in an ordinary grave near the mausoleum and covered with a thick layer of concrete. Khrushchev's anti-Stalinist campaign had changed the face of world communism. But citizens in the satellite countries of Eastern Europe would soon learn firsthand that his reforms did not translate into freedom. Hungary, 1956. In the autumn, many citizens saw Khrushchev's anti-Stalinist reforms as an opportunity for greater personal freedom. Demonstrations to pressure their Soviet rulers into enacting further reforms soon grew into an anti-Soviet uprising. With Stalin's methods still deeply rooted in his mind, Khrushchev did not hesitate for long. On his orders, Soviet forces moved into Budapest and crushed the revolt.
Khrushchev was, of course, an orthodox communist, and communism had always been based on force, threats, and suppression. But if Khrushchev had stepped back in Hungary in 1956, of course, communism would have collapsed sooner.
The international community saw this use of force as a show of strength, but Khrushchev's rivals within the Soviet Union considered it a sign of weakness. They saw the revolt as a direct result of Khrushchev's liberal reforms.
In the summer of 1957, some of the old guard in the Politburo tried to overthrow Khrushchev. A vote was taken and Khrushchev lost. In order to save his position, Khrushchev decided to convene a meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and for there to be a vote at that meeting. Khrushchev thought he had enough people, he had enough votes to save his job, but he needed the help of the military to fly in Central Committee members from around the Soviet Union.
In a Kremlin washroom, a desperate Khrushchev begged Marshal Zhukov for help. Zhukov responded immediately by sending the needed military planes. In 2 days, Zhukov delivered all the delegates to Moscow. Khrushchev survived. His opponents had expected a traditional firing squad, the way plotters had been treated in former times. They were stunned when he ordered them simply to be sent into retirement. Once again, the reformist in Khrushchev had shown compassion, but Stalin's influence was not gone. After defeating his opposition, Khrushchev became increasingly concerned about his powerful ally, Marshal Zhukov.
He relied on Marshal Zhukov, who had been the liberator of Berlin, a man so powerful that Stalin had feared him. Marshal Zhukov, who was then defense minister, participated fully in helping Khrushchev save his job. Khrushchev was grateful to him and realized he owed Zhukov quite a bit. In the Soviet system, this kind of obligation was dangerous.
In October 1957, Khrushchev sent Zhukov on an unofficial visit to Yugoslavia. Meanwhile, he summoned the military and chose a new Minister of Defense, Rodion Malinovsky. When Zhukov returned, he was forced to retire. Zhukov was staggered by Khrushchev's betrayal. Having arrived at his dacha, he called Khrushchev and asked, "Nikita, please explain what's happened." Reportedly, all he heard in response were loud and violent curses. Earlier that same year, missile designer Sergei Korolev began test flights of the R-7, the world's first intercontinental strategic missile. The R-7 was designed to carry a payload of several tons, more than 6,000 miles. The first several tests failed. But at last, in August, the R-7 took off and reached its target. Following this success, Korolev made an unexpected suggestion to use this missile for a peaceful purpose as a launcher for Sputnik, the first man-made satellite. Khrushchev approved, but considered the project insignificant. On October 4th, 1957, Sputnik was put into orbit.
Khrushchev was not interested at all at that time. Sputnik was launched. Soviet mass media did not pay even appropriate attention. But reaction of the international community, foreign mass media, was tremendous. It sent a signal to Russians. Great, this is a new instrument of propaganda.
Khrushchev suddenly saw the space program as an opportunity to embarrass the United States. One successful launch followed another. One dog into orbit, then two dogs. True to form, Khrushchev used the space program to propagate global communism.
Nikita Khrushchev got a phone call from leader of Italian communists who said, please, dear comrade Khrushchev, Compagno Khrushchev, can you launch something? We have elections tomorrow. It would bring a couple of more millions to Italian communists.
A Soviet rocket was launched the next day. On April 12, 1961, the Soviets planned to continue their dominance in the space race by sending the first man in history into space. The cosmonaut chosen for the job was Yuri Gagarin. Khrushchev and members of the Soviet space program knew the operation could be either an incredible triumph or a ghastly failure. Not long before Gagarin's flight, an unmanned rocket designed by Korolev had exploded just before liftoff. More than 200 ground personnel died. No information about this tragedy was published at the time.
Most of all, we feared that we would not be able to bring him back to Earth. Can you imagine if our Soviet cosmonaut was dying in space with the whole world watching? It would be impossible to conceal it.
Khrushchev used Gagarin's safe return to vindicate the communist system and to boost his own power base. He knew conservatives in the Kremlin would be hard-pressed to stop his grandest reform of all, a plan to peacefully coexist with the West. But fate would not allow for a thaw in the Cold War. In 1959, American President Dwight Eisenhower invited Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to the United States. Khrushchev shocked many Soviets by accepting. Both men wanted to remove mutual misunderstanding and mistrust. It was the first time a Soviet leader had visited America. Susan Eisenhower's husband remembered his wife's impressions of the visit.
My wife was a little girl. She remembered very well Nikita Khrushchev coming to see their house, visiting them in Camp David, distributing among all the kids little Red Star buttons, and kids very excited. My mother-in-law now, Barbara Eisenhower, took back all of these Red Stars. She said, don't forget, he is our enemy. He can send the bombs against us. I think it was a typical American attitude.
Still, the visit was a turning point in Soviet-American relations. America made a great impression on Khrushchev. To consolidate this budding friendship, he and Eisenhower agreed to meet in Paris with the leaders of Great Britain and France. A visit by Eisenhower to Moscow was to follow. The Soviet public welcomed the chance to have better relations with the Americans. Once he returned home, Khrushchev went straight from the airport to a mass rally.
As our great Russian poet Alexander Pushkin so beautifully put it, let reason prevail and darkness perish. Long live Soviet-American friendship.
But his new course had strong opponents inside the country and abroad. Kremlin hardliners tried to persuade him that the Americans could not be trusted.
Khrushchev developed second thoughts about meeting Eisenhower in Paris, in particular inviting him to the Soviet Union with a return visit. One factor was the realization that Eisenhower probably would not give him what he wanted, and the second factor was his worsening relationship with China. Immediately after the trip to the United States, Khrushchev flew to Beijing, had a very, very unpleasant conversation with the Chinese. Basically, the Chinese attacked him for being too optimistic about the United States, for betraying class principles of foreign policy.
Mao Zedong sternly lectured the Soviet premier that the proper way to deal with the U.S. was not to be friends, but to continue making preparations for war. Khrushchev was furious. He cursed Mao, stormed out, and canceled the rest of his trip. Then, 3 weeks before the summit in Paris, the Soviet Politburo met. They were surprisingly unanimous in their disapproval of Khrushchev's new policy. Khrushchev had a hard decision to make, but fate suddenly intervened. On May 1st, 1960, Soviet anti-aircraft systems shot down an American U-2 reconnaissance plane. The wreckage of the plane was recovered, and the American pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was brought to Moscow. For 40 years, the end of this thaw in the Cold War was blamed on the U-2 incident. In reality, the U-2 incident was not the cause, but rather an excuse for Khrushchev to abandon an unpopular policy. The Paris summit was canceled, along with Eisenhower's visit to Moscow. Khrushchev's tone toward America drastically changed.
And after all this, goodness gracious, I don't even know what to say. Eisenhower wanted to come and visit us. A man doesn't dine where he fouls, it's that simple. The president fouled in the Soviet Union, and now he wants to come and have dinner with me?
Khrushchev continued his confrontational behavior against the West by disrupting a United Nations session by pounding on the podium. That same day, Khrushchev and the new Cuban leader Fidel Castro met for the first time. The Soviet leader was now anxious to develop a thorn in America's side. A year later, in June 1961, Khrushchev met the new American president, John F. Kennedy, in Vienna. It was just 2 months after the failed American invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs.
He decided that Kennedy was a weakling when he went to Vienna, and Kennedy seemed to be attempting to appease him and to be a buddy of Khrushchev's. And then, of course, we had the Bay of Pigs. And I think that these two elements lured Khrushchev into believing that he could intimidate Kennedy consistently.
In addition to Khrushchev's feelings about Kennedy and the increased tension from the Bay of Pigs, several events during the preceding years also helped put the world on a path toward nuclear war. The stakes started to increase in 1957 when NATO decided to deploy U.S. nuclear missiles in Britain, Italy, and Turkey.
It was one more strategic threat for the Soviet Union. Yes, American missiles were positioned in their country. These new missiles in Europe were capable of reaching targets in our territory in 8 to 10 minutes. We did not have anything like that. We could threaten Britain and France, but there was no way we could threaten the United States.
In 1993, declassified files revealed the initial plans for a Soviet response. A top-secret project was presented to Khrushchev in 1959. 30 artificial islands capable of launching nuclear missiles were to be built in neutral waters around the territory of the United States. The missiles would be able to reach U.S. territory in 3 minutes, giving the Soviets a real first strike advantage. Ever since the U-2 incident in May 1960, Khrushchev had demonstrated a willingness to intimidate and threaten the United States. But he knew the presence of these islands would be too provocative and eventually rejected the project. Instead, he turned his attention to the island nation of his new ally, Fidel Castro, 90 miles south of the U.S. Khrushchev masterminded a plan to place a large Soviet military force on Cuba. The key elements of this arsenal would eventually include medium and long-range nuclear missiles and nuclear-equipped bombers. These weapons would be able to deliver atomic strikes anywhere in the United States. The entire buildup was to be shrouded in secrecy.
From the very beginning, Fidel said, let's announce that there is a treaty between Cuba and the Soviet Union, under which the Soviet Union is bringing troops to Cuba. But Khrushchev would not agree. He said the Americans would find a way to prevent us from doing this. By the way, it was this very secrecy that scared the Americans.
According to the Soviet plan, all preparations were to be completed by October 25, 1962. At that point, the local commander would send a coded transmission to Rodion Malinovsky, the Soviet defense minister.
Rodion Malinovsky said to me, when everything is ready and the missiles are deployed, send me a cable with the phrase, the sugarcane harvest is going well.
Soviet ships began loading their secret cargo in July 1962. It would be several more months before Khrushchev would know if his latest gamble was to pay off. In July of 1962, workers secretly loaded military equipment and weaponry onto ships in 5 different Soviet ports bound for Cuba. Agricultural equipment was also included in order to deceive enemy reconnaissance aircraft. In addition, 42,000 soldiers and technical personnel made the long journey. All of the ships reached Cuba without a hitch. Once on the island, all major movements of troops, equipment, and launch site constructions were carried out at night and were camouflaged during the day. On October 14th, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane took a few dozen pictures in the area of the Cuban town of San Cristobal. The pictures showed intercontinental missile refueling stations, trailers, and missile cases left in the open by careless Soviet troops. On October 16th, Kennedy received the startling report. The nuclear showdown had begun. Soviet intelligence had not been able to determine if the Americans were aware of the missiles. But on October 22nd, it became clear as President Kennedy revealed their existence to the world.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace.
He also announced a naval blockade of Cuba and promised to invade the island if the missiles were not removed. In Moscow, Khrushchev called for a special meeting.
Khrushchev urgently called the Politburo members for a meeting. We all gathered in the Kremlin and were waiting for him. He came in alone, upset, and red as a lobster. He said, "Comrades, Lenin's legacy is lost. Some of you already know and some don't. We have brought our missiles to Cuba as agreed with Comrade Castro, and President Kennedy has just sent us an ultimatum to remove our missiles from Cuba immediately."
Khrushchev worried that a catastrophic chain of events might be put in motion, one that even he could not stop. He said, "If they attack Cuba, we'll answer. That's what makes it all so tragic."
The most dangerous day of the 20th century was October 22, 1962. The Soviet leadership considered using tactical nuclear weapons. If the United States had opted for an invasion of the island of Cuba as a response to the detection of the nuclear missiles, that day we might have had nuclear war.
For 5 days between the 23rd and 27th of October, Khrushchev and Kennedy feverishly exchanged messages. First, Khrushchev denied the Soviet military presence on Cuba in an effort to buy some more time. When he could not deny it any longer, he turned to his preferred method of diplomacy, threats. He wrote to Kennedy, "We will have to take all measures required to protect our rights. We possess the means to do so." Preparations for war began throughout the Soviet Union. The long-awaited launch of a Soviet space probe to Mars had been scheduled for the 25th of October.
Our rocket was to launch an automated probe to Mars. It was already on the launch pad and we were ready to go. Suddenly, we got an order from Moscow to remove the space rocket from the site as World War III was about to begin. We got an order to prepare for a launch of an almost identical R-7 missile. But now, it was to be equipped with a nuclear warhead and aimed at America, who would need a mission to Mars when World War III was about to begin.
Khrushchev demanded exact intelligence reports on Kennedy's intentions, including dates of possible attacks and forces to be engaged.
It was the golden moment for the KGB and military intelligence to provide sufficient evidence on American plans. Would they invade Cuba or not? One can say that everything depended on this answer. Khrushchev didn't get any sufficient evidence.
In contrast, the CIA was able to gather critical information.
In the intelligence battle, the United States won because it detected what was going on very quickly because of the pattern of deployments for intermediate-range ballistic missiles. If the Soviets had been more clever and more capable of deception, they would have varied that pattern, and it would have taken us much longer to detect what they were doing, and as a consequence, they might have had operational missiles by the time that we discovered it, and that would have changed the context dramatically.
On October 26, the American preparations for the invasion of Cuba were complete. The Pentagon waited for Kennedy's orders to launch an airstrike and to land troops from air and sea. That day, Khrushchev received a message from Fidel Castro informing him that the attack against Cuba was due to begin in the next 12 to 72 hours. A few hours later, Khrushchev received a report. Soviet anti-aircraft systems had shot down an American U-2 above Cuba. It is still unknown who issued that launch order. Events were spiraling out of control. As an American invasion of Cuba seemed more and more imminent, Khrushchev realized he had to back down. Despite his long-time emphasis on missile production over bombers, the U.S. had 300 long-range missiles, the Soviet Union only 20. Khrushchev informed Kennedy of his readiness to start removing missiles from Cuba in exchange for Kennedy's promise not to invade Cuba and a commitment to remove American missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev gave orders not to encode the message, but to broadcast it immediately as open text on Moscow radio in order to get the word out as soon as possible. Late in the evening of Saturday, October 27, 1962, a high-ranking messenger rushed the text from the Kremlin to the radio station for a broadcast. The messenger ran into the station's elevator and pushed the button. Suddenly, the elevator stopped between the floors. It was stuck. The messenger started shouting and pounding his fists against the wall. There was nobody to help him since the local repair team was on its day off. He sat helpless, fearing that a nuclear strike would destroy Moscow before he could deliver the message. Finally, an emergency team was summoned. The elevator was repaired and the text of Khrushchev's offer was transmitted to the States. Kennedy accepted the proposal. Khrushchev had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, then pulled back. But in the process, he lost face to the West. For Khrushchev's rivals within the Soviet Union, it was yet another challenge to his leadership. In October 1964, he went on vacation. Meanwhile, his Kremlin associates made a secret decision. Khrushchev had to go. Leonid Brezhnev was one of the few men Khrushchev trusted, but it was Brezhnev who led the coup. When Khrushchev returned to Moscow, his associates confronted him with a long list of accusations. They blamed him for weakening international communism, for his shameful retreat from Cuba, and many other so-called crimes against the Soviet Union. They voted unanimously to send Khrushchev into retirement. Alexander Shaliapin kept notes of the meeting, including Khrushchev's blunt response to the charges leveled against him.
Khrushchev said, "Today you covered me with shit. Okay, I accept it. Now when I am leaving the stage, I want to tell you all, I am not going to fight you or throw dirt at you."
Khrushchev considered the fact that he was exiled instead of executed to be one of his proudest achievements, a sign that at least some of his reforms had taken hold. The colorful man who'd been at the center of some of the greatest showdowns of the Cold War retreated into the background. Khrushchev lived a surprisingly quiet life until his death in 1971. His bold initiatives toward both peace and war made him one of the most influential yet least understood Soviet leaders of the 20th century.
He fought against Stalin's influence, but he couldn't defeat it in his own mind. He reformed Stalin's secret police, and he trusted intelligence reports, but often ignored them. He acted on his own will, and he passionately wanted peace, but pushed the world to the brink of nuclear disaster. He was an orthodox communist, but he was also the first Soviet leader to start the destruction of the communist system.
Had events unfolded differently on just a few occasions, Nikita Khrushchev might have been known by the West as a peacemaker in the Kremlin who helped end the Cold War. Instead, he is often remembered as a bullying antagonist who almost brought the world to an end. A final contradiction for a man whose legacy is as much a paradox as was his life.